Hey everyone, I am Robin the Copy Bitch. This is Stewie, my sidekick sloth, and today it's all about sources. So I'm actually answering a question that one of you awesome viewers left for me about primary sources, but I realized that I have to take a step back and talk about sources in general. So today we're going to cover primary sources, secondary sources, and most importantly, reputable sources and how to make sure that the sources you're using are reputable and credible and why that is so important. So come on in and join us and let's get going. Okay, so before we even get into what is a primary source, what is a secondary source, where do I find this stuff, I want to stress that as a freelance copywriter, especially if you're doing lots of blog posts, lots of white papers, lots of ebooks, big chunk of my job, so you'll probably be doing it too, you are going to be doing lots of research and you are going to need sources for your articles, your blog posts, and for your content, because that's the stuff that can really bring something to life and it can lend credibility to the topic that you are discussing, and it's important. So if you haven't done research in a long time, or if you've never done research, you want to take a step back and maybe read some articles about that, watch this video, and kind of, refresh your memory as to how to go about it. The key thing that you want to remember is you want reputable sources. You want credible sources. Not all sources are created equal. And unfortunately, we live in a very polarizing time, and lots of people can't even agree on what is a reputable source anymore. I'm going to link to a media bias chart that I've included in other videos and other blog posts that I've written, and I want you to take a look at that because that really kind of gives you the lay of the land in terms of publications, from like the New York Times to Fox News and all the different publications and media outlets. And it will give you a good sense as to what's considered a reputable, credible source and what's not. So that'll give you a good guideline as to what you should maybe quote from and what you should avoid as you're writing your articles. Sometimes it is a bit of a judgment call. You have to consider the client, you have to consider the topic, but again, as you do more writing, you're going to get a sense of, gee, this is a reputable source, and gee, this isn't a reputable source, and go with your gut. And you'll make mistakes, but then you'll get better for the next one. So with that being said, let's talk about what is a primary source? First of all, I want you to be careful about the word primary, because I think people hear the word primary, it's very easy to do, and you think, that's the source I need. And it might be, but just because it's a primary source doesn't mean it's automatically a reliable source. And it's not necessarily better than a secondary source. So a primary source can be an original document, so the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, legislation like the actual case law that's written, the actual law written out verbatim, that's considered an original source. It can be photographs and video, and I know we live in a time when we have the rise of deep fake videos and people can manipulate photographs, so you have to keep that in mind. But if you're looking at footage from, say, Woodstock or one of the world wars, that's considered a primary source because it's capturing the moment forever on film and in, a photograph. That's considered a primary source. Diary entries, letters, that's considered a primary source. So the diary of Anne Frank would be considered a primary source. Letters between John Adams and Abigail Adams, again, a primary source. But hopefully just hearing the word diaries and letters can kind of give you a sense. Just because it's a primary source doesn't mean it's necessarily accurate or reliable. It's one person. What Anne Frank was experiencing was one perspective. What John Adams was saying to Abigail Adams was one perspective, and whatever he was dealing with from his very specific point of view. Okay? Other primary sources, interviews. So if you talk to a subject matter expert at the client, with the client, the company that you're doing work for, if you talk to someone from the company and you're interviewing them, they would be considered a primary source. By and large, as a copywriter, probably the type of primary source you're going to be using most often in your work will be statistics, official, incredible statistics. And I need to stress that because anyone can spout off a statistic, like Stewie could say 90% of sloths are awesome. What about the other 10%, huh? So, and you might be like, okay, well, where did that statistic come from? He's like, it came from me. That's all well and good, but is he as reputable as, something else? It's probably not the best example I'm giving, but hopefully you get the idea. Anyone can spout off a statistic. If you go to Thanksgiving dinner, you probably have your weird uncle spouting off really crazy statistics. So you need to be careful. You need to consider the source. And when coming up with statistics, you will get good at this and you will get accustomed as to where your go-to places are. So a great place for statistics is a place called Statista. I think it's statista.com. It's like this treasure trove database of tons of statistics. Some of it's behind paywalls, but then there's a lot that is open. I often go to Statista when I need stats on like social media usage and, do baby boomers use TikTok and things like that. Other places you'll go for statistics. I'm based in the US, so any government site. So if I need statistics on the unemployment rate or how many people are in a certain industry, I'll go to the US Labor Department and do a search to get statistics from them. The CDC, if I need statistics on different diseases and percentages of people who have diabetes or something like that. I do work for a urology clinic, and anytime I'm talking about urologic cancers, my go-to for statistics is the American Cancer Society because it is always updated. They have every cancer imaginable and fresh statistics and that are very easy to understand, and a variety of types of statistics from diagnosis to remission rates and things like that. So you will get used to and accustomed to the best places for certain statistics in the industries you're writing in. But you always want to, challenge yourself and be like, is this the most credible source for this statistic? And if the answer is yes, great. And if you're not sure, then keep digging or look around or talk to colleagues to see if you can find a better source for the statistic. And you will get more comfortable with this. And by and large, that's going to be the primary source you're using most of all in your writing. So, have I covered everything for primary sources? You think so? Okay, that brings us to what is a secondary source? So a secondary source, and again, I don't want you to get hung up on the name secondary and think it's less than primary. It's different, all right? And again, it's all about the quality of the secondary source, the quality of the primary source. So that's what you'd have to consider. But let's get back to what a secondary source is. A secondary source is just a step removed, really, from a primary source. And it'll often rely heavily on a primary source. So the best way to explain a secondary source is by way of example. So I mentioned that the Diary of Anne Frank is an example of a primary source. Anne Frank writing in her diary, put in book format for everyone to read. Okay, great. A secondary source would be if someone, a biographer today, published a book about the Diary of Anne Frank or about Anne Frank's life, and they would more than likely rely heavily on the diary, but then maybe they add new research that's been unearthed or new commentary or new analysis. That's an example of a secondary source. Now, when it comes to secondary sources, again, not all sources are created equal, so you have to think of who is putting out that source and why. Do they have an agenda? Do they have a specific angle? Or what are they trying to do? So here's another example I can give. Let's talk about the Gettysburg Address. Abe Lincoln, right? Okay, that's a primary source. Doris Kearns Goodwin, if you're familiar with her, she is a well-respected biographer. Lincoln is her topic. Anything she wrote, I'm sure she did write about Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, that would be considered a secondary source. She's relying on the primary source material, but then she's bringing in additional analysis, insight, commentary, okay? Now, maybe Uncle Bob was also a big Lincoln fan. Maybe he has a blog that he dedicates to Lincoln, and he wrote a big, long missive on the Gettysburg Address and brought in his commentary and thoughts on it. If you were writing a piece, which secondary source would you go with? The Doris Kearns Goodwin or the Uncle Bob blog? And again, this is an extreme example, but that kind of shows you have to think about the quality of the source and not just what type of source it is. So you're going to go with the Doris Kearns Goodwin. Of course you are, because that is just more credible. She's more respected. She is well regarded in all things Lincoln. That's how you have to think about things. So again, it's the quality of the source, where it's coming from. Is there an agenda? Again, check out the media bias chart that I'm going to include below, because that's going to kind of give you the lay of the land as to what types of news publications and news outlets you should consider quoting from, or that are a good idea to quote from, and which ones you might want to reconsider just because they might have a bit of an agenda and that could skew what you're writing. Like if you're, and this is, I'm not trying to make a political statement. If I were to quote from Fox News or if I were to quote from MSNBC, both, and that's left, that's right and left, right? So you have the extremes on both sides. I probably would avoid those just because I know how polarizing they can be, and it's probably going to rub someone the wrong way. And that's not what I'm trying to do when I'm writing for clients. I probably would want to go with something a little more neutral, a lot more neutral, like AP or Reuters. All right. So again, consider the quality of the source, consider the credibility of the source, consider, if there's an agenda. And then you have, your primary sources, you have your secondary sources. So going back to primary sources, the person who actually started this whole discussion was asking me, where she can find primary sources. So we talked about statistics, but she was going more for like some of those older news articles or videos or things like that, like those primary sources, especially from a historical context. So I have a great example because I just did a blog post for a client. One of my clients does compliance in the trucking industry. So for Women's History Month, I did a blog post on the first women truck drivers and who was the first woman truck driver to hold a commercial driver's license. And I went way back in time. I went back to like Stagecoach Mary, which was really cool. And then did some, historical tidbits on different women throughout the last 100 years or so. So when I sat down to write this blog post, I just started Googling, women truck drivers in history. And that kind of, brought up some stuff, and I came up with some names. And then the place I went to, I had a woman named Luella Bates. The place I went to was Wikipedia. And I know there are people out there probably cringing, going, why would you go to Wikipedia? I didn't quote from Wikipedia. I didn't use Wikipedia as my source. But there's nothing wrong with starting your research with Wikipedia because they do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. And the nice thing about Wikipedia is they link to all of their sources. So they link to their primary sources and secondary sources. Some are better than others. Again, you have to judge and vet and think about things. But a lot of that heavy lifting is done. So especially for like a historical figure, someone who's born in the late 1800s and kind of, came into her own in the 1920s and 1930s, it was perfect. So I read this article, and there were lots of really like great primary sources. And when I say primary sources, I mean primary sources. I was able to find this woman was quoted in Popular Science Monthly, from 1920. And I was able to, thanks to Wikipedia, go to the actual like page of that magazine and see how it was written and see what was said about her. There was a clip from the Daily Republican, of paper in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, or I'm probably messing up my facts because I'm already it's all kind of messing around in my head. But again, I was able to go right to the clip. And then the nice thing about that is I was able to bring that color to my blog post and then link to the original sources. So if people wanted to see it or see where I got the information from, they could. And that's the whole point. When you are writing your content, your blog posts, your white papers, your ebooks, you want to include well-vetted, credible sources, and then you want to link to things so that other people, if they want to double check or read more, can do it. So make sure you're doing that. Take those steps, and it really will enrich your writing too if you bring in some of that color and some of that interesting stuff. One of the biggest issues I have, and this goes back, I think this is what actually started the original video that I did, and this has to do with statistics, and this happens so often, all the time, still. I will come across a statistic that is really compelling and would totally work for whatever it is I'm writing. And the blog post or article that I'm reading will have the statistic, and they might, say where it's from, but they don't link to it. That's, mistake number one. Or they will link to it, but what they're linking to is not the original research or the original source of that statistic. They're linking to another article that talks about the same statistic, and that article is linking to another article. So it's like this big weird loop where all these articles are linking to each other about the statistic, but no one's linking to the actual place where that statistic originated from. And that's problematic. To me, that's problematic. It's not that I doubt that these people are making it up or that the statistic isn't real, but why not link to the original research? And there's usually more interesting stuff if you can find the original source of that statistic, of that survey, of whatever it is. So because I'm like a dog with a bone, I will often, spend a half hour, 45 minutes trying to track down the source of that statistic. And sometimes I'm lucky and sometimes I'm able to do it, and then I feel validated, and it's great because I can use the statistic and I can link to the original source of it. Sometimes I can't find, where the statistic originated from. And again, it's not that I think someone's making something up. I mean, I suppose that's possible, but then I have to let it go because it's just not worth putting in something that I can't give proper attribution. This brings up something to do with interview subjects. When you are interviewing subject matter experts, again, you're talking to a subject matter expert. That's a primary source. Like if I'm talking to a doctor at the urology clinic, they're a primary source. They're talking about prostate cancer, they are a primary source. But they're human, and humans are fallible. They can misspeak, or they can say something that, they might give a statistic that is inaccurate, or if I can't find a source of an original source for that statistic, I'm not going to link to it, and I'm not going to include it. That does occasionally happen. I'm not just talking about doctors. It's with a lot of my clients where they're just so excited about whatever it is they're talking about. They'll be like, oh, 85% of blah, blah, blah did this and da, 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 or I went to a conference and I heard that, 95% of this. And it's like, okay, that's really interesting. Can you get me the study or wherever that statistic originated from? And I'll put it back on them. I will. And more often than not, they can't, because they either misheard or they wrote it down incorrectly or whatever. This recently just happened where one of my clients had left some notes in a blog post that I was getting ready to write, and we were talking about things to pay attention to with your website so that you do well in Google and you rank well. And she's like, oh, I've read in several articles that Google penalizes if you use stock images in your blog posts or on your website. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. Is that true? And gee, I really should know about that if it is. So I started to do some Googling, and I ended up on an article, I think from Search Engine Land, which is considered a very reliable source in general because Search Engine Land, they do all things search engine. I often go to them. And this particular article, they were interviewing people from Google, It was a transcript of an interview from some Googlers, like people who work on the search team. And it was about this very question. And they were pretty much saying if you use stock images, Google's not going to penalize you in search because of that. At least according to this article at the time I was reading it. So again, I was able to debunk it by actually finding a secondary source that included a primary source. So you can't, we make mistakes, and I make mistakes too, and don't think that I've been doing this for 20 years, so don't think that I've always gotten it right. I certainly haven't. I'm sure there's an article out there in my early days where I probably did link to Wikipedia as my source. I cringe at the thought now, but I would never do that now. At least it would have to be like my own blog, and it's just very casual. I'm just doing something very basic where I'm linking to something and people can read further. But for a client, I'm going to be focusing on credible sources, really thinking about the quality of the primary and secondary sources I'm using. And you should too, because that's what you're trying to do. And again, you want to put out good content like that because that's going to help the client and they're going to be happy with your work. And then, they're going to continue to give you work. And this is one of the reasons why, I know I'm kind of going off on a tangent here. This is one of the reasons why I'm not worried about AI right now, like Chat GPT and stuff like that. I've been playing around with some of these AI bots. And the problem with that is that, first of all, you don't know where they're getting their information from. The information is often wrong. All of these bots sound alike. So, if you're cramming in high school and you need to write a 1,200 word term paper on the Odyssey or Othello or Romeo and Juliet, sure, you probably can get away with it because an analysis, the AI probably can do a fairly decent job at that. But an AI to have to write a blog post about women in, women truck drivers throughout history, I actually gave that prompt to the AI. This was after I'd written the post because I was curious as to what it was going to come up with. And it just, it was very, I don't know how to describe it. It was robotic. I mean, that's what it sounded like. It was like, okay, there would be no way I would hand this into a client. There was nothing special. It didn't have that special pizzazz. I mean, there are no citations or anything like that. So AI is not there yet. I'm not worried about AI coming for me or my job. It might someday, but I'm not there yet. So I wouldn't worry about that. But again, you need consciousness. You need that human touch of being able to be like, and that critical thinking and being able to evaluate and being like, you know what, that's something about that stat doesn't sound right. Let me double check that. And that's something you have to do too. Like, you can't take everything at face value. That was the problem with some of the stuff that AI has been coming out with. It's coming out with incorrect things. So you can't necessarily take everything as fact that's out there. So I think I need to wrap this up. Yeah, Stewie absolutely agrees with me. So hopefully this gave you some things to think about. When it comes to sources, always think about credibility, reputation. Does it have an agenda? Where is it coming from? Check out the media bias chart. I'm going to link to it below because that's going to give you a good sense of, here are publications where, if I'm beginning research and I need some help, I'm going to start with this. And these would be the places to quote. And here are the ones that I should maybe avoid. A mixture of primary and secondary sources is absolutely fine in blog posts, and that's what you're going to have. And there might be a blog post where you just have a primary source because you're doing an interview with a subject matter expert, and there might be a blog post where maybe you're just relying mostly on secondary sources. It's as long as the quality and credibility is there. Primary doesn't necessarily mean it's better than secondary. That's not what primary means in this case. So again, use your judgment. Be honest, be critical, challenge yourself, be critical of the things that you're coming up with and looking at. Ask yourself if it's the best source, if it's the most credible source. You will make mistakes sometimes, and that's okay, and just get better and be mindful. Be mindful about all the sources you put in there. Make sure you give proper attribution, especially to quotes. Make sure you link to the sources that you're pulling from. Or use footnotes, or both. It depends on how your client wants you to do things. But there you go. So if you have more questions about this, please ask away in the comments, and I will either do a new video or I'm going to write a blog post about this, and I can address it in the blog post as well, and I'll link to that in the description. But I think this video is long enough, so let's wrap it up. I am Robin the Copy Bitch. This is Stewie, my sidekick sloth. If you liked this video and found it helpful, please give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, just move along, and we will see you next time.